We are fortunate enough to have Professor David Watson here this week. He made time to fit us into his busy Brisbane schedule, so thank you for that. He is a professor of ecology at Charles Sturt University. In addition to the ecology of parasitic plants, his research focuses on large-scale connectivity conservation and developing innovative approaches to biodiversity monitoring and measuring ecosystem health, which is something that I'm sure a lot of us think about. So hopefully it'll be a very enlightening talk. And the title is New Insights into the Ecology, Evolution, and Ecosystem-Wide Impacts of Mistletoe. So take it away.
Thank you, thank you. All right, everyone. Let's start. The old turning it on trick. That's all right. I can make this fully interactive too. All right, so help me out here, people. I just want to go forward.
The mouse does. Do you want to bring that closer?
Yeah. Perfect. Oh, look at this. It's in the radar. It's like Shakespeare. All right. This is great. Next. This is going to be interesting. All right. So I tend to get a bit enthusiastic, and so I'm going to forget to acknowledge things at the end of the talk, so I get my acknowledgements in early. What I'm going to be presenting here is 25 years worth of work with many collaborators, funded by many different organisations over a long period, and this kind of work can't be done alone. So I'm the person up here talking about it, but it's the work of many. There's got to be a better way to do this. So just letting you know, I'm here today talking about mistletoes. That is a small component of what I do. As mentioned in the intro, I work on biodiversity monitoring more broadly, whether it's birdie things, broad scale stuff, acoustics work in the arid zone, in the neotropics. So what you're seeing today is one of the hats that I wear, but there are multiple other hats.
I'm going to sit here and click when you say it. Change slide.
Yes, thank you. In the mistletoe space, it's tragic. I'm the mistletoe tragic from way back. I collect antique Victorian mistletoe harvesting tools. I have an extensive collection of mistletoe-related ceramics. I've collaborated with mixed media ecofeminist artists on mistletoe-related installations. I'm not going to talk about any of that today. So just understand that the Dave Watson Mistletoe Mansion is a very large, rambling house. You're just going to get a sneak peek into a few rooms in the next little while. Look at that. So this is where we're going. I appreciate that many of you are coming from a wide background. Some of you won't know much about mistletoes, if anything. Others of you know a great deal. So I'm going to start by getting us on the same page about what these things are. Then I'm going to start with an evolutionary context, give you a little window into what we now know about where mistletoes came from, when mistletoes first appeared, and for the first time in Australia, share with you a new idea about the ecological origin of mistletoes in the fossil record. Then going to dive into a couple of interactions, specifically dispersal and the reliance of mistletoes on birds to move them around, and some ideas around the differential role that different kinds of birds play. And then pull back from all the individual interactions and talk about broader effects on diversity generally, about patterns, and moving towards process. So this whole talk, we're going from, hey, that's interesting, to, what's driving that, and to what's the actual mechanism that is operating, which is, in ecology, having a mechanistic understanding of something is sort of the dream, because that then tells you which levers you can pull on if you're wanting to do something about that system. So think of this as an assorted platter. I've given you a lot to graze on. I'm not expecting you all to just dive in and eat everything on that board, but if you're in a chickpea kind of mood, I'm hopefully going to give you the botanical ecological equivalent of a chickpea. So let's bust a few myths. Please don't feel bad if you think that all these things are true. I have people coming up to me at conferences who are convinced that all these things are true, as well as less informed people berating me about these things. All of these are misconceptions. So let's just break them down now. No, they're not introduced weeds. Yes, there are things called mistletoes that are in Europe. There are also things called magpies and robins that are in Europe. They're different. Same name, different critter. There's 97 species of mistletoe in Australia, 3 island endemics, 2 haven't been described yet, so the real number is around 100, of which more than 70 are endemic. We share a few with New Guinea, a few with various islands, a couple with New Caledonia. Next one, please. Little Johnny got into the mistletoe, ate a fistful of fruit. Should I call poison control? No, for the most part, Australian mistletoes are not only not toxic, but they're very tasty for a whole lot of different animals, not just the fruit, but the entire plant. And you can see if you're driving around in grazing country, if there's low mistletoes, you can see a very clear browse line where sheep, goats, horses, whatever the animal in that paddock is, has gone out of its way to nibble on those leaves. This is a popular one. That bloody mistletoe has killed all the trees. Mistletoes are parasites. They make a living by taking from their host. They don't have a functional root system. They take all the water that they need from the vascular system of the host, along with whatever's dissolved in that. It is not in a mistletoe's interests to kill its host. That is literally biting the hand that feeds it. So yes, you can have mortality-inducing infections of mistletoe. That's typically when the host is not doing too well to begin with. There's way more mistletoes in that tree than that plant can support, is quite often the case. So think of it like fleas and dogs. Fleas can kill dogs, but it's a pretty sick dog if a few fleas are going to kill it. And then, I'm just pointing this out, sorry, can you go back?
I don't know.
That's fine, don't go back. And this is a common one. That just picks out the weak ones. It's those trees that are unable to sort of defend themselves. And we've actually found quite the opposite. That quite often, especially in the arid zone, those trees that sport mistletoes have more resources to spare than uninfected trees nearby. So quite the reverse, that a tree that's supporting mistletoes quite often is doing quite well for itself. And if it's struggling to survive, it doesn't have the resources spare to allow it to support a mistletoe to maturity. So there, that's hopefully busted a few misconceptions that some of you may have had. So let's talk about interactions. And this is the suite of interactions that basically determines the mistletoes that you would have seen in the last week or two. These are plants that are dispersed by birds. They're also plants that are pollinated by birds. They form a weird structure in the canopy of the trees they infect. So from a microclimatic point of view, from a structural point of view, they diversify the canopy. There's a whole lot of insects that are mistletoe specialists. The only thing they eat, the only thing they lay their eggs on, the plant they rely upon for their entire population is either one species, one genus, or one family of mistletoes. So very popular browse. If you have a good look at a mistletoe, you'll find insect damage quite easily. And then litter, which I'll talk about towards the end of the talk, is one of the really interesting effects of mistletoes on ecosystems. They churn through their leaves. You need to remember they're parasites. The same rules don't apply. They didn't work hard for those resources, so they give them away freely. Next slide, please. And if you want to know more, get the book. Okay, so that's scene setting. Now let's dive in. Hopefully there's some evolutionary people in the audience because it's about to get real. All these things are mistletoes. And there's a bit of a paradox in looking at them, and these are different lineages, not necessarily close related to each other. They show a very similar set of features, all to do with their aerial parasitic lifestyle. That's to do with being dispersed by birds, that's to do with latching onto their host. They're really cool anatomical adaptations in order to do that. Unpacking, how did that whole series of traits come into being from some ancestral form that wasn't an aerial parasite is devilishly tricky. And there's been a few ideas around it, but no one's really pinned down exactly how, when, and where pre-root parasitic shrubby things turned into canopy-dwelling aerial mistletoe things. Next slide. Some work has been done on the morphology of the connection between the host and the mistletoe, the haustorium. Next slide, please. You can do all sorts of fun crafts with them, but you can also use that to build a robust phylogeny of them. And you can see that there's 5 different lineages of root parasite that have independently become stem parasites. Mistletoes are not a monophyletic group. They're a group of things that has independently, through parallel evolution, gone down a very similar trajectory. Next slide. There's a very new phylogeny, came out a couple of years ago. Very contorted, so I'll just go to the next slide where I've simplified things. Here it is, colour-coded for your convenience. This is the Santalales, a very large group of plants. Sister to olives. Olicaceae, olives, just a regular garden variety plant, no parasitism going on here. And then at some point there was a root parasitic form that diversified, and 5 of those root parasitic lineages became mistletoes. That phylogeny that came out in 2018 used time-calibrated fossils in order to date key nodes on the phylogeny, which gives us, in tens of millions of years, when these evolutionary events happened. Next slide, please. I'm going to focus on these 2 lineages. They're by far the most diverse lineages of mistletoe in the world. And Loranthaceae is the one that you would know. If you close your eyes and think, give me an image of mistletoe, it's going to be a Loranthaceae. They're the big droopy ones that you see on street trees in Eastern Australia. But we have a problem, because these are the sorts of things that mistletoes worldwide rely on for their dispersal, either moving their pollen around or moving their seeds around. Next slide. But when did those beasties appear relative to when mistletoes appeared? Next slide, please. 2 main groups. Songbirds popped up sort of 30, 40 million years ago. Hummingbirds split off from weird nightjar type ancestors around the same time. So that's here. And we got a problem. Because the transition from root parasitic shrubby thing in the forest to aerial parasite up in the forest canopy occurred pre-songbird. No one's ever realised that before. Next slide. So let's go back then. Let's go to 55 million years ago. That's what the world looked like. That's the closest thing we had to a mistletoe. It lives in the Blue Mountains now, or at least it used to. It might be extinct in the last month. Atkinsonia. It is an unremarkable looking shrub. You would walk right past it if it wasn't flowering. It looks like an olive. Chest high, succulent red fruits. That was what Loranthaceae looked like, the Eocene-Paleocene transition. Next slide, please. Pre-songbirds. Who else was climbing around those West Gondwana forests that might have been snacking on fleshy fruits? I hear you ask. These guys, Microbiatherians. Next slide, please. There's one of them left, of this whole group of ancient marsupials that used to be in Australia, that used to be in Western Gondwana land. The Monito del Monte, a gorgeous little wacky marsupial. Oh, what's that? That's a mistletoe seed. They are mistletoe dispersers. So there's an idea that this guy, in those ancient Eocene Western Gondwanan forests, was the agent not just that was the first mistletoe disperser way back when, but was the thing that took the seeds from the root parasitic shrub in the understory, clambered around into the canopy, defecated out some seeds, and hey presto, pots and pans, a mistletoe is born. Now that's a nice story, but when you're dealing with interactions that go back 50, 60 million years, you're never going to get a fossil of, this kind of business. So all we can do is come up with a consistent story where the dates and the times and the ecological habits of the modern day representatives all line up. Let's see if we can do that with the other lineage of mistletoes, the Viscaceae. So that happened here much earlier, about 70 million years ago. World looked different back then. The sisters to this group is a bit obscure, but they're all sort of quirky, forest, interior, shade-adapted, root parasitic shrubs with fleshy, animal-dispersed fruits. Those are the modern-day representatives of the sister taxon Viscaceae. Next slide, please. This is before lineages from back then are pretty obscure. Early primates are quite abundant in the fossil record in this part of Laurasia, in sort of what's now North Africa. Next slide, please. With this champion, with the best name you'll hear today, Purgatorius, being the most dominant form of these early stem primates. That's best guess of what it looked like. It's about a squirrel glider, sugar glider size beastie. Next slide, please. Remarkably similar to two other very early diverging primates, the galagos and bush babies, and the Madagascar endemic dwarf lemurs, both of which are really important mistletoe dispersers, but they do it in a different way. They don't ingest the fruit sticks its sticky seeds to the outside of them, they groom it off, wipe it on a branch, and a mistletoe is born. Again, the dates, the times, the locations all line up fairly compellingly. For mammals to be the agent of this, you've got mistletoes up in the canopy then, and then around there, when you see massive diversification occurring in all these lineages, that's the rise of songbirds. And there's an analogue for this. There's another, even weirder group of parasitic plants in Southeast Asia, the largest flowers of all, Rafflesia, vine parasitic, holoparasitic plants, live inside vines and just pop out these melon-sized buds that turn into these giant flowers. They're dispersed by tree shrews. So there are equivalents today of mammal-dispersed parasitic plants, so it's not too much of a stretch to think that that might have been a reason for mistletoe evolution way back when. And just to clarify, so that's the hypothesis. And intriguingly, this explanation, especially the differential kind of dispersal, the large fruited internal Lorenthaceae, the small fruited external mode of dispersal Viscaceae, explains a lot of the trait differences you see in these two different families. Okay, next slide. So that's all to contextualise where these things came from, and that idea is a brand new one. Today, there's 10 lineages of birds that are mistletoe specialist frugivores. All they eat is mistletoe fruit. All they feed their chicks is mistletoe fruit. The grand champion of them all is a yellow-crowned tarantula that builds its nest exclusively out of defecated mistletoe seeds. You couldn't make that shit up. Now, most of the work on mistletoe dispersal has focused on these lineages. Because they eat nothing else, there's a presumption that they must be the ecologically important partner that moves mistletoe around. And you look up textbooks, you go to the index, which you all do when you first get a biology textbook, and look up mistletoe, and you'll see under the subheading of mutualisms, a picture of a mistletoe and a bird, and hand in hand into the sunset. That's mutual benefit. Plant gets dispersed, bird gets a feed, yay. Moving on. But that wasn't really based on much data, so we decided to look at this in a bit more detail. When you start looking at these kinds of interactions, it gets complicated pretty quickly. So we wanted to go to a relatively simple system where we could study things in a more holistic way. So we went to inland Australia, where it's very, very flat, very dry. You get these little ephemeral creek lines that might flow for 3 or 4 days every 4 or 5 years. What you're seeing in that creek line are two different kinds of plants, hosts and parasites. The hosts are long-lived acacias. The parasites are two different kinds, sticky, uppy, root parasitic sandalwoods, and blobby mistletoes in the canopy, in this case, Amiuma pricei, the needle-leaf mistletoe with pink fruits that is dispersed a lot by the mistletoe specialist frugivore, the mistletoe bird. Next slide. So we put a bunch of call recorders out at a bunch of locations to keep tabs on who was coming and going when we weren't there, so for a full year, and then did searches at all these locations. So some of those locations, the red ones had mistletoe, the yellow ones had no mistletoe. So mistletoe areas, no mistletoe areas, simply asking a very simple, weirdly negative question: do mistletoe birds ever go to areas that don't have mistletoe? Are they the agents that take mistletoe to new areas? Do they spread infection to new uninfected stands? To do this, we listened to the calls, but we also did searches of shrubs all around those areas, looking for defecated seeds. To test the students were keen-eyed enough, I went in a little earlier and put a few Phaco poos there to see if they'd find them. Every single time they did. So I'm confident that their zeros are actually meaningful. And we found, very simple answer to that question, no. Mistletoe birds exclusively forage in areas with not just a bit of mistletoe, a lot of mistletoe. They go from infected area to infected area to infected area. It makes sense. That's all they eat. So that's nice. So they're intensifying existing infections, probably spreading them, overloading the same hosts with even more mistletoes, but they're not the partners that are taking mistletoe to fresh real estate. So who is? We looked at one of the candidates, this case the spiny-cheeked honeyeater. This is not a specialist. This is a generalist. They eat insects, they eat nectar, they eat a wide variety of fruits. Here's a roadside area in around Forbes in New South Wales. The weird inverted cross there is the extent of mistletoe-infected acacias in that roadside stand. Traces are a bunch of different birds that we put radio trackers on to see where do they go. And what do you know? Because they're eating other things, they go from areas with mistletoe to areas without mistletoe all the time. And if we can model the gut retention rate and look at the seed shadow, you can see that they're going, almost a kilometre in some cases away from the point source, away from where they first had that feed of mistletoe fruit. This is not a specialist. This is a generalist that eats a lot of things. And so it got us thinking, maybe generalists are actually more important, ecologically more important, as dispersal agents of these plants. But Australia doesn't have a very high diversity of these kinds of birds. There's only 2 mistletoe specialists in the entire continent, mistletoe bird and painted honeyeater. So I wanted to go to a system that had a fair bit more of both specialists, generalists and opportunists. So I did a sabbatical in Barra, Colorado Island, without a doubt the best studied tropical forest on Earth. That's the 6-hectare plot, the 30-hectare plot. It's every single plant in that plot is measured every 6 years, down to the scale of toothpick-sized seedlings. They do it every 6 years because it takes 6 years to do it. A spectacular place. If you've got the opportunity to visit, grab that opportunity with both hands. Spend a bunch of time camped out, next slide, looking at, if you struggle with bird ID, don't go to the neotropics. There's multiple pages that look like this. So those are my 2 opportunists. Those that eat a lot of bugs and occasionally fruit, including occasionally mistletoe fruit. There's 2 specialists. 2 terranid flycatchers. These are all terranid flycatchers, subalcine passerines. Yellow-crowned terranulate, mistletoe terranulate, all they eat is mistletoe fruit. And then this little guy, ruddy-tailed flycatcher, is an obligate frugivore. It only eats fruits in the forest understory, including mistletoes. So we've got our opportunists, we've got our generalists, and we've got our 2 specialists. So camped out for months on balconies and on boats, looking at infected trees, looking at which birds were taking fruits. Very simple question. And just forget the species, just looking at those functional groups, the specialists, generalists, opportunists, found sure enough the things that only eat mistletoe fruit take the majority of the fruits, presumably therefore disperse the majority of the seeds to the order of about 3/4. But a quarter was taken by other things, including the generalist frugivore that eats other fruits, and these opportunists, similar to the spiny-cheeked honeyeater, that go much, much further afield in search of other things to eat. That's just one study from one system, so let's not get too carried away. Tallied up all the other work that's been done on this sort of thing worldwide for both Viscaceae and Orientaceae, the 2 big lineages I spoke about to start with. Yes, those are some big numbers, but if you look at the generalists, there's some pretty healthy numbers there too. There's a lot of seeds are being removed by birds that eat other things. Generalists are, numerically, very important dispersers in many, many systems. Now, that's a lot of numbers. Picture tells 1,000 words. Look at the grey. That's the global distribution of mistletoe, worldwide. And on top of that, very conservatively, that's probably a much smaller, is where the mistletoe specialist frugivores occur, the things that eat nothing else. And you can see, at a glance, that there's plenty of spots you know and love, good old New Zealand, North America, all of Europe, where there's plenty of mistletoe. It's getting around just fine without any mistletoe specialist frugivores at all. So yes, mistletoe specialist frugivores necessarily need mistletoe. Mistletoe doesn't necessarily need the specialists. Next slide. They're not the textbook example of the co-evolved mutualist. A better analogy is a self-serving market gardener. They're diligent little dudes crapping out the seeds, making a much more defendable resource for themselves. Often, it's a lower quality dispersal than they're getting from the generalists. They're overloading the same number of hosts, potentially compromising population trajectories of both host and parasite. Whereas generalists, those unsung heroes that are eating a lot of other stuff, getting further afield, it's a rarer event of disproportionately greater ecological importance. So for the birders in the room, you're going to get misty-eyed at this. There's not that many mistletoe specialist frugivores on Earth. There's a buttload of generalists that eat mistletoe occasionally. And we know very little about them. We know very little about where they go, the other things that they eat. And so if we want to know more about mistletoe dispersal, we need to focus not just on those weird ones that just go from mistletoe to mistletoe to mistletoe. We need to focus on these champions that go to other places. And they're the ones responsible for taking mistletoe to strange places, including probably all the oceanic islands that have their own endemic mistletoes. So you think of an island, Hawaii, the Galapagos. Think of a remote island, Henderson Island. They've all got mistletoes. And that's from rare events, necessarily not by specialists. Mistletoe birds have a gut passage rate of 14 minutes. You don't get to Hawaii in less than 14 minutes. Next slide. And it's the rare event that we're talking about. When you study dispersal, you're necessarily interested in long tails. It's the rare event that matters here. That's a regurgitated pellet from an Australian raven, landed on stony ground, full of germinating seeds. Nothing happened there. But every now and then, one of those lands in a spot where it can actually establish and bingo. Over evolutionary time, that's diversification. For the mammalogists in the room who are glazing over a bit, here's an analogy for you. Another example of where a specialist may not be the most ecologically important interactor. This is a long-nosed bat. It's got this lovely, lovely morphology. It shoves its head deep into saguaro cacti in southwest United States. It was thought for a very long time to be the co-evolved disperser of columnar cacti. Nice story, very cool. But then they realise that there's the pallid bat is also there. This is a badass. They are immune to scorpion venom. So if you want to spice up your life a bit, why eat just centipedes? Have some scorpions as well. They also eat nectar from saguaro cacti. Unlike the specialist long-nosed bat, they get all their nitrogen from arthropod prey. The specialist, in order to get nitrogen to balance its diet from all the carbs it's getting from the nectar, periodically goes back to its roost, grooms all the pollen off its face and eats it. This guy doesn't do that. He looks like that all the time because he couldn't give two hoots, because if he's hungry, he'll get frickin' happy. So these guys, Winifred Frick did the work, it's in AmNat, it's exquisite. It shows that the unsung hero of, in this case, saguaro pollination is not the so-called co-evolved specialist. It's probably this guy that does a bunch of other stuff, including this, moves further afield, is a far more efficient disperser, in this case of cactus pollen. Now, I can't move on before explaining that there is a mistletoe that is found only on columnar cacti. It is a holoparasite, it's got no green tissues at all. It lives its life entirely inside cacti and punches out its flowers when it chooses to, in Chile. Okay, so pause. That's one series of interactions in detail about seed dispersal. How are we going for time? Laughing. Let's pull back now and think about all the interactions involving mistletoe and what effect that has at broader scales. I can't come to Queensland and talk about keystones without using this example. This is the textbook example of what a supposed keystone species looks like. The idea being it's a species that has a disproportionate influence on diversity in its system. Large bird, only bird big enough, with a big enough at either end, to ingest large fruits, move those seeds around, take them away from the shady understory to a light gap, and hey presto, you're getting recruitment of a whole bunch of trees that otherwise would not be able to recruit. So in Cape York, just one of 300 or so birds in that region, take it away, and your forest is going to lose plant diversity quite rapidly. Now, nice idea. How would you test it? Well, you'd need to remove a lot of cassowaries from a lot of places and then wait for a few hundred years to look at tree recruitment patterns. So not only is that an ethical nightmare, grant agencies don't deal in centuries. So that can only remain a heuristic. That can only remain, okay, that makes sense, but there is no smoking gun, there is no strong evidence to suggest that actually they really do affect tree diversity in this way. It just needs to remain a more of a conceptual idea. Whereas mistletoes are custom made for this kind of manipulation. I put out the idea that mistletoes function as ecological keystones. They have a disproportionate effect on diversity. That could be to do with direct effects, or it could be solely to do with indirect effects of productivity with mistletoes and birds, and diversity, both responding to the same underlying gradients, and there's no causative connection between them. So to do this, that's the highway between Melbourne and Sydney. This is the Upper Billabong Creek catchment, just north of Albury. 40 farms with 40 chunks of grassy box woodland on them, and removed every single mistletoe plant from half of them. So you'll see the mistletoe, next slide. You'll see the mistletoe just there, next slide. All gone. So, next slide. So did that about 30,000 times, which is a non-trivial logistical exercise. That's a lot of mistletoe to remove at the entire patch scale. And we lost a third of our birds. In 3 years, a third of our woodland birds were no longer there in the sites where we took mistletoe away. They were there, and actually they rebounded. They went up in the sites where we left mistletoes alone. We did sham removals in those control sites. We drove randomly around them with cherry pickers, cutting random branches off random trees to hassle them, but left all the mistletoes intact. So that's nice. First, really strong, direct experimental evidence of something that's thought to be a keystone doing what a keystone is supposed to do. So you can have your killer whales, you can have your sea otters. This is way more influential. And then there's a keystone index that looks at the influence on diversity as a function of biomass in the system. And if you run those numbers, and we had good biomass data because we weighed every single mistletoe we cut off, it's having a disproportionate effect to the tune of 132. That's for all birds. So it's 132 times more influential than you'd expect based on how much of the fraction it is of a woodland biomass. That's for all birds. That's bloody wood duck and ibis mixed in there. Take them away, look at just woodland birds, and you're getting to 170, which is way above the sort of nominal thresholds of what is designated a keystone. Weirdly though, if you looked in detail at the responses, the things that we know depend directly on mistletoe to make a living, they eat the fruit, they eat the nectar, they nest in mistletoes, they responded, but not nearly as much as we expected. Insectivores instead appeared to be far more sensitive. So media went bananas once that was announced, because Europe gets pretty excited about mistletoe. There's a lot of mythology based around mistletoe. And so when a study from the other end of the world found that it affected diversity in such a striking way, it became quite an event. But I was still collecting data, still probing to try and get to that mechanism, because it wasn't what I thought it was when I first started this project. And insectivores just kept on coming up as important. So here's the numbers I've already given you. Control. Is that the right? Yes. So if you look, comparing control sites to the blue sites where mistletoe was removed, huge difference if we're looking just at insectivores. Take insectivores away, so that's all species, that's a third or so of the diversity that I mentioned at the start. Massive change in insectivore communities. Take that away, and there's no difference for everything else. Look just at those insectivores that do their insectivory on the ground foraging insectivores. Again, we see a pretty clear-cut response, a bit noisy, and there's a bit of a response in other things. But remember, this is just ground foraging insectivores. All the other insectivores are now in everything else. So these are animals that spend no time in mistletoe at all. They don't even go in the canopy, and yet they're having this clear-cut pattern, experimentally induced. So, we know a bit about these birds. We're concerned about these birds. We've got a name for them. We call them declining woodland birds. And what do they eat? Bugs on the ground. And what do bugs on the ground eat? Litter. Leaf litter. So maybe there's this unknown pathway that wasn't even in our minds when we set this project up, that could be driving some of the patterns we're seeing driven by litter fall. So we went back to work, and instead of thinking like a bird, we needed to think like an insect. Next slide. There's a lot of data here. Next slide. I just want to draw your attention to, of all the things in woodland litter, a relatively small subset of them are preferentially eaten by insectivorous birds. We call them, very technical term here, the tasties, as opposed to everything else, like millipedes. Very few things eat millipedes. They might be abundant, but they're so full of nasties that most things don't eat them. This is what it's all about. And we looked at this in detail and found that not only are they widely consumed, they're widely consumed for a reason, because they're full of goodies. They've got a lot of fat, they've got a lot of protein, and a lot of micronutrients that are scarce and that are often limiting to birds. Then we did some more work, this time at the tree scale, not the giant woodland scale. Used various methods, pitfall traps, litter bags, under infected and uninfected trees, and found under a tree, once you scale it up, at the woodland scale with mistletoes, add mistletoes to a woodland, you're getting around 2.5 to 3 million more insects per year of the kinds of things that these woodland insectivores eat, and that's at the hectare scale. So you as a conservation manager, you're worried about a particular group of organisms in your system. It's like, oh, how am I going to look after the babblers? How am I going to look after those pesky hooded robins? If you could pull a lever to make more food that you know those little suckers eat, well, you would do that. That's the lever you're going to be pulling on. And mistletoes, because of that litter, they seem to be that important for that particular stratum of Australian woodlands that are generally nutrient poor. That's a big number. That's a throw up your arms and run around number. And so think of invertebrates in this system, and the insects and the things that eat the insects as really the engines driving a lot of these whole of system patterns that I was finding in an experiment, and that has since been reported in a whole lot of other studies worldwide about insect abundances fundamentally changing. They're telling us a lot about soil health, about plants, about litter, and about nutrient dynamics. And the group of organisms most sensitive to that are the insectivores, including insectivorous birds. So you might think of this as just a happy picture of woodlands, diverse woodlands with flowers and multiple layers. Also think about litter as part of that. This is beyond mistletoe litter. There's many plants that are champion shedders. Acacias, casuarinas, Exocarpus, the Sandalaceae generally. Some plants churn through their leaves, as opposed to the other end of the spectrum, eucalypts, which are complete misers. Sclerophilous plants, they hang onto their leaves for as long as they can. They fill them full of nasties because they're protecting their investment. So anything you can add to that recalcitrant litter is going to free up a lot of these resources and make these places far more resource rich for a whole suite of organisms. Yeah, that's labouring the point. So now we're getting towards some mechanisms. Now we're able to say what's actually driving the patterns we're seeing, and animals are integrally part of this. So this is a plot split in half. If you look at just one half, this is plant interactions of how parasitic plants affect hosts and how parasitic plants affect their world. Add animals to the mix, and suddenly you've got a source for these nutrients. This isn't just reallocation. This isn't just parasites taking from the host and then dropping it right under. That doesn't actually add anything. It might concentrate nutrients, but you've got birds, you've got insects coming from further afield. Nutrient transport, cross-system subsidies. This has been studied in many systems, and it's almost certainly what's driving this heterogeneity in nutrient inputs that we're seeing. And so many of the plant interactions we've been talking about, whether it's facilitation, whether it's even legumes, the effect that legumes have, a lot of that, I suggest, is mediated via these visiting, interacting animals. Legumes are tasty. Something comes to eat a legume, drops off a package from another meal from later on. That is going to facilitate growth of things around it, more potentially than the nitrogenous bacteria in the nodules. And the mechanism here is very clear. It's driven by not just high quantities of leaf litter. Add 7 mistletoes to the canopy of a eucalypt, you double the amount of litter that falls in a year. It's a non-trivial amount. They're full of cations. Every cation we've looked at is way more concentrated in mistletoe tissue. Because they're parasites, they don't care. They don't hang on to their nutrients, they just let them all go. Every proper plant out there, before it sheds its leaf, withdraws all of its nutrients, shoves waste products in it, makes the leaf a weird colour, tree then sheds the leaf. Mistletoes don't bother. You look at a freshly shed leaf and a living leaf, they're entirely equivalent in terms of their nutrient composition, because they can keep slurping it out of the tree. This is by no means an Australian-only system, an Australian-only finding, and it's by no means a mistletoe-only finding. I have colleagues in Norway working on root parasitic herbs in willow shrublands above the Arctic Circle. Got colleagues in Zimbabwe in monsoonal savannas. Colleagues in Spain in pine forests. In these cases, it's mistletoe. In that case, it's Orobanchaceae herbaceous things. All the patterns I've told you about nutrient inputs, about parasitic plant litter, quantity and quality, driving diversity of patterns via boosting heterogeneity in return rates. There's parallels across all of them. So this is a parasitic plant thing, and it is most definitely a global thing. So to bring this back home to maybe a more familiar example, in the Pacific Northwest, there's a particular tree called the Western Red Cedar. It's a forester's dream, very straight-grained, very high dollar, quite easy to work. Foresters have known for a long time the trees growing beside creeks that go to the sea, that have salmon coming and going from them, grow faster. They get fatter trunks. Foresters preferentially went right up salmon streams as far as they could go to get the big, chubby Western Red Cedars. Mechanism, who knows, who cares, cut the tree down. Along came some ecologists and gave us the mechanism. The reason why Western Red Cedars grow bigger next to salmon streams is because bears are messy eaters. 70% of the nitrogen in that tree is marine derived. It came from this bad boy that migrated to sea, got fat on open ocean shrimp, came back, got eaten by this guy, pulled up on the bank, high-graded the nice belly fat, and then left it. That's fertilising on a massive scale marine-derived nutrients plonked in various places, completely altering nutrient inputs and growth dynamics of a forest, in some cases 500-600 kilometres from the sea. So these nutrient subsidies we're only really now just starting to learn about. Peter Vatusek has been on about this for years, found that Gobi Desert dust was the secret to productivity in Hawaiian Islands from micronutrient stuff coming down. Parasitic plants are these little accumulators, these little lenses of productivity at every scale you look at. There's an entire forest, that's a 1 kilometre scale, with transects showing amount of dwarf mistletoe in Washington State. Some areas have lots, some areas have none. Zooming in, there's an infection centre of dwarf mistletoe under the Wind River canopy crane. You're seeing some areas with a lot of mistletoe, large areas with no mistletoe. And then you go under an individual plant that has mistletoe in its canopy, you can see the lens of mistletoe litter as opposed to all the other litter. That's heterogeneity at regional, meso and local scales in carbon, nitrogen, potassium, a list of about 17 elements. And that's what's driving coexistence at many, many scales, hence the very large scale patterns we're seeing affecting diversity. I shall leave it there. Thank you very much. Go on, Hugh. You know you want to.
You go, Hugh. It's fine. So I had students a long time ago canning mistletoes in the southeast of South Australia where there don't seem to be many mistletoes. And then we were canning along the highway number 1 between Gambier and Melbourne. And I wanted to get them to count them so we could see how they live. Very simple, simply practical. But then I sent them into the forest and there were no mistletoes at all. They wandered around the forest looking for mistletoes. And these were just simple eucalypt mistletoes, very easy to see before the things peaked in the wall. Something like that. And I was sort of amazed. Then I saw hardly any mistletoe birds, but the mistletoe birds just went up and down the road. So highway number 1 in was the only cool thing, and I never understood what was going on.
Yeah, so the roadside patterns there's a few things going on there, and no one's done the proper study to put them all together. Dispersed behaviour is certainly part of it. Tree health is also part of it. Roads shed water, so plants growing beside roads have greater access to water and are more able to support parasites at maturity. I think random birds, are more likely to perch on the edge of something before they move in, and so a random roadside tree is going to be visited by more. But this is not Darwin. This is seat of the pants. And natural enemies, possums are one of the main controlling factors in mistletoes across southern and eastern Australia, and possums are often edge-averse. They're afraid about owls. They're afraid about predators, and so they smash mistletoes in complete coverage canopy systems on the edge. They sort of get in, get out. And brush-tailed possums, we've got good data on this. Their favourite plant in our work on fecal analysis and radiocolor animals is mistletoe. So if you're seeing a lot of mistletoes in one area and are wondering why, possums are sort of the flip side of that. Possums are the little champions who are mowing it down all the time, and if there's a lot of mistletoe in the area, that's because possums aren't there for whatever reason. John?
Dave, how long did it take for you to get those arthropod patterns when you removed the mistletoes and had litter and no litter? How long did it take to see those huge effects on arthropods?
So we did the arthropod stuff two ways. We did it under infected and uninfected trees, so that was not experimental. So we just used the existing pattern of there's mistletoe there's no mistletoe there, let's look at what's there. So that could have taken decades to build up. Then to try and get an idea of time frame, we made litter bags like freshwater people do, like just gauze litter bags with different blends. We got a similar effect, but it was way noisier. And so I think it does take time. So we left those bags for 3-4 months. That was not nearly enough time. So I think if I wanted to do more of this, years, multiple years, you'd need to do experimentally, because anything to do with eucalypt litter takes a long time. It's recalcitrant, it just sits there. And there's interactions with water, as you know, water availability as well. If it's wet, then it's going to decay more rapidly. So we tried a few pod experiments looking at effects on growth rates of plants. That work has been done in other systems, and good reliable effects on annuals especially. So you do get some weedy things prospering under mistletoes.
Yeah.
Thanks, Dave. Why do you think that mistletoes are generally not included in like habitat condition assessment frameworks? Is it because the detection is just quite hard to identify and detect?
It's a few things. So mistletoes are parasites, and when your child has parasites, they're not allowed to go to daycare. So the P word is a really big deal, and I think, and it's completely subconscious, a lot of ecologists think negatively about parasites. Predators, that's a pretty barbaric way to make a living, eating other things, but we're cool with that. We've got documentaries about it. Parasites as a whole are unloved. Parasitic plants are often completely overlooked. If you look at sort of go-to practices from either in the forestry world or in the veg science world, epiphytes as a group, but mistletoes in particular, often are just simply not looked at all. They can be low detectability, but I think that's a bit of a cop-out. I think they're just not on the radar, and that's one of the things I'm trying to do by banging the drum, is to say, look, they actually do matter, probably more than you realise in many systems. A bit like coarse woody debris. It's like, I just crap on the ground. It's like, we'll measure it, because it kind of matters for a lot of the processes, a lot of the organisms that make that system what it is. So I'd say it needs more love, and a lot of that's an awareness thing, but a lot of it's subconscious.
When mistletoes come back, were you experimentally remove them, and how long did that take?
Okay, so the way we removed them was with cherry pickers, and the boom lift we used, we could only get one that went 14 metres high, and with a telescopic pruning saw, we could get to sort of 18 metre high mistletoes. There are a few that we couldn't reach at the first removal, so I filled out all the paperwork, and I got a guy with a high-powered rifle to come in and clean up those last little ones, and they were all gone by the time we got there because of possums. Because possums, we'd taken all their food, So there are a few left. They smashed them for us. So we left it for 3 years. I thought I'd need to do a follow-up removal. I did a follow-up removal 6 months after the initial removal, and they were all gone. I went back 5 years after the initial removal, and you wouldn't have known the difference. They were all back. So this is a system where there's a lot of scattered trees between remnants, and they were often full of mistletoe. So there was no shortage of propagules within line of sight of a lot of these sites. So lasting effects of this experiment, I might have knocked around population dynamics of a couple of mistletoe specialist butterflies for maybe 1 generation. So I can sleep well at night. It wasn't lasting. Jerry?
How can we harness mistletoes as a management tool? Like, can you actively transplant them to a place where they're gone from? How can we use this?
Sure. So there's a few people talking about this and a few people doing this sort of stuff. So I'm working with City of Melbourne to do this in downtown Melbourne with... Go to the next slide if you can. Next slide. Yes. Just read that quote from Tim Flannery. It's classic. He's a bit of a divisive character, but he's got a way with words. He's got a standing bet at his local in Adelaide. If anybody brings in a plane tree leaf with signs of herbivory, he'll shout the whole park. He reckons that plane trees are as useless for Australian wildlife as concrete. So we're using plane trees as our hosts in downtown Melbourne to make them better by putting mistletoes into them. And that we're expecting a lot of blowback from locals, and we got quite the reverse. We got people saying, "Oh, I'm from Melton. Can you do it in our place too?" So I think there is an interest in using mistletoes. There's a couple of city-based projects in New Zealand doing this, where there's a small number of mistletoes that some of them are quite rare because of possums. And in Arizona, there's talk of incorporating mistletoes into riparian re-veg around ephemeral arroyos. But again, it gets back to the question about why aren't they included in veg assessments. A lot of it is an awareness thing, and I think now that the worldwide literature on this is very clear about the effects they have on processes, many processes that we care about. And the mechanics of introducing them is actually quite straightforward. It's not that hard, but you're working against the natural enemies. And so the work we're doing in Melbourne with possums, we've got to fit possum collars onto all the trees, because otherwise you put the seed there, it sprouts, and it's grazed off that night. So there's many things that make a living by eating it. So you've got to get it to a point, and that can take a while to reach that threshold. But yeah, that's happening. And certainly in Europe, different story. Because they love mistletoe over there, there's companies you can buy mistletoe kits, give them to your girlfriend for Christmas, little instructions on what kind of tree, fresh fruit, do it within 2 weeks. So they're mad for it there. And I think the rest of the world can take note.
So it doesn't have to pass through a bird, so you don't have to rip it out.
Don't have to wipe your ass in the tree. No.
Just stick the gooey seed.
Yes. Yes. So you trigger germination. You break dormancy by just squeezing it out of the fruit. If you want to keep some for a project in a few weeks, as long as you keep the fruit intact in the crisper of your fridge, it'll last about 6 weeks. But then squeeze it out on a tree, well lit area, underside of the tree, pencil thick or thinner. It's in the book.
David, what species are you putting on the plane trees?
Muellorina, eucalyptoides, creeping mistletoe. So we were concerned about potential branch fall and car parks and all that stuff. And so Muellorina it tends to grow on main trunks.
I know all about it.
So yeah, Muellorina eucalyptoides, creeping mistletoe. And it's a local and it grows on main trunks.
I've seen here, they've got to play with the liner on plane trees.
Yeah, there's Macquarie gets on plane trees now and then as well. Fox mistletoe. Yeah. A lot of them are floozies. So some mistletoes, it's just casuarinas, I just do mangroves, I just do proteaceae, but there's a handful of them that'll latch onto citrus, plums, all sorts of exotic things, including deciduous things, which from a physiology point of view is mind-blowing. I think we're done. Any last questions? All right, cool.